So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is a big room, and I'm so glad to see the Tri-State Conference growing. And thank you to the organizers, of course, for having me. Crisis. I love a good crisis. I don't know about you guys, but when it comes to PR, you know, a lot of the day-to-day stuff is not as exciting or dynamic as TV makes it out to be. So when a crisis happens, although you start to sweat, it's hard, you're scared, you're nervous, the adrenaline is pumping, but when you get through the other side, it's like you've been to war and you have conquered, hopefully, not been defeated. So I love to talk about crisis. I love to prep for crises. And if you ever have one, call me because I just want to gossip about your crisis. It's fun. So a little bit about who I am. As Megan mentioned, I am president of Effect. We're a PR firm. We work mostly in tech and healthcare. But I'm also very involved in PRSA and in the PR Council. I also had the pleasure of attending NYU my first year of college. Went overseas after that due to another crisis, but we won't go into that. Sorry. Okay. So here are a few crises you may be familiar with, and some you may not. These are all crises that I have had to work on. So I named a few of the companies where the crisis was public, left a few out if it was not. So we worked with Con Edison during Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene, 38,000 worker strike, a manhole cover explosion, a building explosion in Harlem. They gave me all the crises I could want. But we've also dealt with, tragic situations, of course. There have been loss of life. There have been both civil and criminal suits that we've dealt with. We worked with a company where an employee actually hit and ran over someone in the parking lot of their company. Sexual harassment, I could list many, many of those, unfortunately. We had an executive of a rehab center arrested for DUI. That was not fun. We have even worked with a lot of companies in Israel, and unfortunately there's a lot of terrorist activity. We have been in wartime situations where all of the executives were conscripted to go back to active duty. And one of the first crises that I started my career on, I won't tell you how long ago, but it'll give you a hint that it was the Y2K crisis. Does anyone know what Y2K is? In this room, a few people, a few gray hairs. So I was working at the time at Edelman, and one of our clients was EDS, which was a huge international corporation run by a former presidential candidate, Ross Perot, who, again, most of you probably have no clue what I'm talking about. And when it was going to turn the year 2000, people were acting as if the apocalypse was coming because all computers were not going to know what to do when it went from 1999 to flip to 2000. And EDS had created a war room, literally, where we were going to be up for 36 hours, watching the clock turn midnight in every time zone in the world to see if the apocalypse arrived. And, I was very excited to be in this war room with all these EDS executives and to watch this happen. You may have guessed the apocalypse didn't happen. But that night, what did happen was militia in Iraq who were holding EDS employees hostage decided to free them. So the crisis that we expected was not the crisis that actually happened on that night. So even when you think you know what's coming, you don't. So just some little bit of background. Okay. So in traditional crisis relations, everyone has kind of a different formula or different phases that they use. I like to talk about the 4 R's: readiness, response, reassurance, and recovery. And in theory, they should go in order. But in the age of now, they don't always go in order. They often happen simultaneously. And you have to be prepared for any of them at any moment. So I wanted to share this, and I apologize, I noticed a mistake right before I got up here. A few years ago, we worked with Plan B one step. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's sometimes referred to as the morning after pill. And it's controversial in and of itself. And when we were working with them, a new generic version was coming out, and the Plan B one step was coming out with a single pill versus a multi-dose pill that they had before. And although it is sometimes referred to in the public domain as the abortion pill, it actually does not cause an abortion, but rather prevents conception. And when we were representing them, we were actually working with them specifically on social media. And as you can imagine, people are really passionate about this subject, for or against. And whenever you're working with a really controversial topic, crisis communications is the first thing that you think about. And of course, if you're working in pharma. So we had to start what I would call a decision tree about anticipating what potential crises could be when these announcements came out, and then of course, what potential problems could come up. And one of the things that we had to decide, and that you'll at some point in your career have to decide, is whether or not this is a crisis and whether or not we're going to do anything about it. And so, for example, when we would see comments pop up online and social media, is this good news for the company? Yes? Great, we don't have to do anything. Perfect, great news. Is it not good news, whatever this comment was, or this angry rant on Facebook, or someone tweeting up a storm? No, it's not good news. Here's the mistake, I'll show you. So is it factually, this should say correct. If it's factually correct, even though they hate us, even though they don't like it, even though they have a strong opinion, even though they think it should be banned, even though they think no one should have access to it, if it's factually correct, I'm going to stop and not engage with this person because I can't add to the conversation. But if it's factually incorrect, then I need to continue the conversation and see what would the next decision be. Now, when we're talking about a topic as divisive as this kind of drug, we also had to look at who is posting the information. Is this a person that I can ever influence? So if this is a person posting, let's just say from Westboro Baptist Church, I'm probably not going to change their mind. I'm also probably not going to change the mind of anyone who's following the church. So I'm not even going to engage because I'm only going to add fuel to the fire. But perhaps this is a college student asking a question in a public forum and they want to know how it works, or they want to know what to tell their friend or where they can get it. So that is a person I'm going to engage and respond to. Now, what you'll see in a lot of corporations is there is some sort of decision tree when you see a crisis. However, they don't always, and we don't always, make the right decisions. So, when can a crisis strike? I know I wanted to see that guy today too. Okay, so a crisis can strike at any time. And remember, if we talked about before, whether you know what the crisis is or isn't going to be. So this was, if you're not familiar, an exchange, with Donald Trump and the world on Twitter, attacking a woman who was a former Miss USA. Was it Teen USA? Miss USA? Miss Universe, I'm sorry. And he was not happy about the attacks against him on his character. And he, of course, recommended that we should all look up her sex tape. And then, of course, Donald Trump's own Playboy tape surfaced the next day. So when you think you're heading into one crisis, you may, of course, find out you're actually heading into another. And although none of us can say whether or not this would have surfaced had he not proposed that we run that internet search, that's what it means when I talk about you need to make a decision, engage or not engage, because you can sometimes make things worse than you intended. Okay. So anticipating a crisis, one of the things that will cause major depression is to do some crisis mapping, but it's important. And this is where you try to figure out what are all the possible things that could go wrong. Now, don't do this for yourself personally in your life. I don't recommend it. But if you have a client or a company that you're working with, it's necessary. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. What are the policies and procedures we need to have in place in order to prevent a crisis or potentially mitigate a crisis? So although some of you look young enough to not know when tweeting didn't exist, I mean, what did we do with all those incredibly important thoughts of 140 characters? But there was a time when you had to really implement a social media policy, because if not, folks could get on Twitter and talk about the company and say, disclose things about the CEO or complain about their job or whatever it is, and you can still do that to some degree today. But there weren't necessarily policies in place about who could use it, what information you could share, that it still had to focus on what your company's corporate policies were. So you may have, again, some policies in place. And crisis monitoring. If you have no clue that it happened, you cannot prevent it or stop it from turning into a huge fireball and going down in flames. And of course, having a crisis plan in place, plan of action, and some standard communication templates. So let's think for a minute like the crisis of Chipotle. And my kids love Chipotle. If I had worked in fast food, there are a few potential crises that I would put on my SWOT map of what could potentially happen. The fact that someone might get food poisoning, probably a high probability when you have a lot of stores. There could be a crime committed in a location. A fast food worker might be disgruntled. I know you'd never expect it, but they might be upset. Some potential consumer might go berserk in a restaurant, be upset with their order or rant on the internet. You can think of all the different things that would happen. So you might create, for the most important crises, some sort of standard template of what are we going to say if this happens, and leave a blank space for whatever it is that happened. I like to map it out based on kind of internal threats and external threats. And we're not trying to, again, find the folks who have the most anxiety to come up with every possible disaster scenario, but rather what are the most likely crises to happen so that we can be prepared for those. And typically what we do is find those crises and then rank them in order of most likely, least likely, and also try to look at which ones are the most potentially damaging or the least potentially damaging. I mean, some brands have crises on an everyday basis. You know, if you're going to have thousands of stores or millions of consumers using your products, you're going to have people who are, you know, pissed off that you've discontinued Twinkies, and there's really not a lot you can do about it. So you have to be prepared for all the different ones, but know which ones you need to pay attention to, which ones are more meaningful or more impactful. So in terms of how long do you have, you know, although I share this, there is no rule, and I'll show you a couple of examples. You really can't know how long you're going to have. If I say something controversial and you tweet it, I could have 1,000 negative comments before I get off the stage, but don't do that because I will find you. But it can happen at any time. I mean, a few years ago, I don't know if you remember the Justine Sacco crisis, and she was a PR person who tweeted something about not getting AIDS because she's white and she's going to Africa, and then by the time she got off the flight, her life was in shambles. So you never know how long you're going to have. But when you know the medium and how quickly it works, you really have to take that into consideration for how quickly you need to respond. Okay. So how many of you have heard of Tamika Cross? Okay, quite a few of you. So this is a relatively new story. Ms. Cross is a doctor. She was on a Delta flight. It's only last week. She was on a Delta flight, and a gentleman seemed to have, a medical emergency in the middle of the flight. And just as the stewardesses were standing up and starting to get organized to help this gentleman and to find a medical person on board, Tamika stood up and was trying to offer help, and she was immediately waved away, like, "Oh, no, miss, we're looking for doctors." And I won't go into all the details, you can look it up, but basically she was not allowed to assist in this situation. When she persisted, she was grilled about, where did you go to medical school? Can I see your credentials? And eventually, another gentleman who happened to be a white male doctor was allowed to assist the person who was having the medical emergency. As you can imagine, she was pissed. And she posted, I'll go back one second, she posted her frustration and her rant on her own Facebook page. And people were so enraged. As you can see, this was shared 149,000 reactions, 48,000 shares. And surprisingly or not, it was the Daily News was the first major media outlet to break the story. They actually first reported on October 9th. This is a screenshot from October 14th because they updated it, but they gave the background of everything that happened. They shared, of course, a link to her Twitter handle, to her Facebook post, and they were the first major media news organization to report it. But it didn't take that long for it to go international. BBC, New York Times, CNN, it was all over the news. And of course, calling Delta racist and talking about their policies and how this African-American woman was snubbed and questioned about her credentials while they let a white doctor go ahead and assist the man. Now, if you recall, Tamika posted on October 9th. It was only when the major media caught wind of it that Delta decided to respond publicly. And if you read through this, and you can take a look at it, it's on their website, it's buried in their news hub about their business. They do not actually apologize. They talk about the investigation, they talk about their policies and procedures, they say that it's ongoing. They, of course, claim to not discriminate in any way, shape, or form, but they really have not owned this woman's situation or even apologized for any wrongdoing that could have happened in the cabin while they're doing this investigation, which of something that happened 5 or 6 days earlier. So it should have been enough time. And of course, you know, when a corporation does not respond in a way that people deem appropriate, oftentimes the internet can gather and take over the conversation. And what we're seeing now is tens of thousands of people posting with hashtags of what a doctor looks like and talking to Delta. So you see this one tweet, say, Delta, since some of your employees need a course on what a physician may look like, here are a few for you. Not good PR in general. And we'll see what happens if it has a long-term effect, of course, on Delta. But this is a crisis that I certainly would not have wanted to happen. Okay, so now if we were doing that SWOT chart for Delta, we may not have imagined that this is what would happen, but any corporation today that isn't looking at discrimination as a big title or sexual harassment as a big title or big group really would be remiss in their preparation for a crisis. So what we do recommend for companies is to have a crisis toolkit ready. Even when you don't know all of the possible scenarios of what could happen, you do know that there are certain things that you want to communicate every time. And you can prepare those templates so that when you get that 3 a.m. phone call, you pull out your template and it only takes you 10 or 15 minutes to fill in the information that you need. So we talk about having some messages, having some prepared statements, even a statement of, we are shocked and appalled by what we have heard. We want to conduct a thorough investigation. We will update you within the next 24 hours on what we have found. We apologize if anyone has been hurt or negatively impacted by this incident. We're going to do our best to rectify this situation. Even that would appease people for a short period of time. But when you say nothing or don't acknowledge it, the fire gets bigger. You also need to train employees. I have been in situations where if you've ever watched TV and something's happened in a store, and the reporter finds the first guy on the street to tell them what happened inside, and you're like, oh my God, someone shut that guy up if you work for that company. So employees need to know, are you allowed to speak on behalf of the company? And if not, who do they need to call? Because when that New York Times reporter doesn't get through on the main line, he's going to dial every single number until he gets a live person. And he'll take a quote from the janitor because they work at your company. So you need to make sure that employees know what to do. Preparing channels. I can't tell you how many times I have heard about companies where something has gone horribly wrong and nobody knows the password to get into the blog, or nobody knows how to take over Instagram, or their Facebook page has been hacked, or maybe not hacked and they're just claiming it's hacked, but no one's got the keys to the car, So you have to make sure that you have all of that kind of in your emergency toolkit and ready to go in case this crisis happens. We also recommend, for example, with Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene, people didn't have power. So you couldn't tell them, go to the website and report your problem, which is how most of the problems are reported to Con Edison. But people maybe had a little more juice on their cell phones. So we set up in advance a number that you could text to tell them that you had a problem, or text to tell them where you are. We also set up dark sites. So if the servers that were housing conedison.com or housing the company website go down, we could point the servers to another location so that you have another site. That's really important. We've seen even government entities be hacked. And a few months ago, you could go to like the FBI website and it had like all of this ISIS propaganda that someone hacked into it. So no one is immune to it. Everyone needs to be aware and prepared. Okay, so I apologize. I see this is a little hard to read, probably from the back, but I'll walk you through it. If you're not familiar with, this is a timeline of the Mylan EpiPen scandal, crisis that's currently going on. And what I wanted to show is, although we talked about how some things can happen in minutes or days and happen very quickly, there are also oftentimes a slow burn of things happening. And if we're not monitoring or paying attention, we'll miss them. But more often than not, I find that what happens with companies is they know that that crisis is there. They know the problem exists, but they make a conscious decision to ignore it and hope it goes away. And typically, it does not go away. So what we're seeing with the Mylan EpiPen crisis, and this is a timeline that was put together by a company to show that this is only on Twitter, not even in mainstream media, but the first tweets about this issue and about the price of the EpiPen going from $25 to nearly $500 happened back in May of 2015. And I'm sure they knew that this was happening. And then in September, we actually had someone at Bloomberg report about the increase in prices of drugs, and specifically name Mylan. And we also saw them talking about this incredible injustice because there were more and more healthcare companies that were refusing to pay. And in fact, one of the most disturbing tweets at that time was someone who said, my insurance company won't pay the $4.95 for an EpiPen. I guess they prefer to pay for my autopsy. Like, wake up, Mylan. Like, you need to pay attention if that's the kind of PR you're getting at this time. And then what we see is we're getting a little more activation. The media is starting to pay a little more attention. And when we get to the point of about 20 or 30 tweets a day, is when a petition has been developed on the internet for folks that want to petition both the government to investigate and petition Mylan to lower the price. But when things go absolutely insane is actually when news comes out that the CEO of Mylan, who testified before Congress by this point that the increase in price of 400% was absolutely necessary because the increase in costs, her personal compensation had been increased over 5-fold during this time. Actually, I'm sorry, something like 600%, including her bonus. It was something insane. We should all be working in pharma, by the way. But it was, people were just outraged, and of course, then the conversation took off. But the point kind of in this narrative is, they knew. They could have done something. They could have stopped it. They could have prepared. But clearly, they ignored it or decided to forge ahead thinking perhaps profits are more important than their reputation. They might be rethinking that now. Okay. So preparing a response. Not to harp on Trump, because I do think that he provides a lot of great content, but also, politicians are somewhat immune to the normal crisis communications common wisdom, so to speak. Because they are such divisive characters, you have folks that no matter what will never change an opinion of where they are. And then you have folks that, you know, every once in a while go down in flames, like an Anthony Weiner, if you're not familiar with that story. But what I think is important to understand is that when you sit on something, when you don't react to it or when you don't prepare, that's typically the point when most companies get into trouble. If, for example, we were advising Delta and that had happened, I probably would have issued a public apology on October 9th, I would hope, or October 10th. I would not have waited until it was on CNN and the BBC and in every major media outlet before, and it's not even an apology, before I issued a statement acknowledging that it happened. And you know, when you're in a situation, kind of on both sides, I look at, for example, the audio tapes that came out about Trump, and this one, I'm not talking about the fact that it exists, but the fact that NBC held on to it for 4 days and did not publish it before the Washington Post scooped them, that's also a crisis in and of itself, because you have this information and you didn't make it public, and then it reflects poorly on your own organization. So one of the things that I also see is that when something happens, you do have a lot of parties in the room. You know, the shareholders that want to make sure that they don't lose the value of their shares in the company. You'll have the legal team that is freaking out that they're going to be sued, or that you might say something to cause them to have some civil liability or criminal liability in your statements. What I always recommend is acknowledge the situation. The fact that you say reality happened does not put you at greater risk. So to say, yes, I said this on tape, yes, this happened, yes, this situation occurred, does not put you at greater risks. It just makes you sound like a rational human being who acknowledges that reality happened. And if somebody was hurt in the situation, especially if there's loss of life or loss of income or some physical impact, you can express empathy without taking blame. So in the Con Edison situation, you know, people were hurt, people were injured on multiple occasions, and we had to talk about the fact that it was tragic that there was loss of life and that there was deep regret at you know, injuries that were sustained or the impact that it had on families. Does it mean they're responsible for the weather? No. But you can be human and you can acknowledge that somebody was impacted by this, whether or not you take the blame. I always recommend committing to investigate. You don't have to know everything. And again, this is kind of what happens to companies. They say, we don't want to make a statement till we know everything. Or we make a statement when we really know nothing, and then it turns out that it was all a lie. So it's okay to say, we don't know. But we are going to find out, and we're going to get back to you by X date, by X time. We're going to have a news conference tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, whatever it is. That's always important. And if you have a plan for corrective action at that time, let them know. This is how we're going to literally stop the bleeding, or how we're going to correct the situation to make sure no one else is impacted by it. And I always recommend responding to the crisis in the format it was received. So the crisis started on Facebook with Tamika. Delta, respond in a comment on Facebook. And one of the reasons I want you to respond there is so that everyone else who reads that chain sees that you've responded. If you only bury it on your website in the news hub, who's going there? No one. So you're not even participating in the conversation if you want to be. Okay. So crisis template response. Again, going back to what needs to be included. I want to know what happened. Let's acknowledge that the situation happened. A few years ago, there was an incident at Domino's Pizza. I don't know if any of you remember this. So 2 employees had a little fun adding bodily fluids to a pizza. It wasn't nice. And these incredibly intelligent folks taped themselves and posted it on YouTube. You can imagine that Domino's wasn't happy about it. But what I gave props and respect to the CEO of Domino's for, he knew that people were searching for this video. And one of the first things that they did was, of course, file an injunction to have it taken down from YouTube. But when he labeled his apology video or his acknowledgement video of what happened, he used the same terminology and the same search terms. So it was titled like disgusting Domino's employee pizza incident. So it wasn't titled Domino's CEO speaks out, because nobody's searching for that video. So he knew that he wanted everyone who found it to be able to find this apology video in their statement at the same time. So you do have to be brave about that. Acknowledge who's impacted. How do we feel about it? A lot of times companies don't want to say how they feel. Surprise, surprise. But you are human. Companies are made up of people and employees. And if someone has been impacted, please share. What are we going to do about it? When are we going to do it? And how and when are we going to communicate? Often companies don't yet know what they're going to do. But if you give a timeline of we will update you by X time, you buy yourself a window of time. So that's important as well. So here's another example. Anyone here have a Samsung Note 7? Please leave the building. Okay? You're not allowed to be here. All right, so if you have not heard about it, the Samsung Note 7 came out and unfortunately explodes spontaneously. And Reuters did a really nice kind of recap of the timeline of this crisis. And these are just some important dates. I didn't want to share everything. But this crisis is only about 2 months old. What's important to understand here is Samsung launches the Galaxy Note 7. They sell it, and the reports almost immediately start coming in of exploding devices. Now, Samsung puts out a statement saying, it's a faulty battery. We'll just exchange it for a new one. These batteries are better. Now, when they announce that they're going to exchange it, they don't actually have the items to exchange them with. So they let people continue to use them. And then the FAA is tired of these devices bursting into flames on their planes. They issue a warning at this point, just an advisory to passengers not to turn on or charge your Note 7. I would think someone at Samsung would have woken up at this point. Then the US Consumer Product Safety Commission says, don't even use the phone at all. Samsung is still quiet. Then they say, you know what? We're going to force the hand of Samsung, and we are recalling these items, 1 million of them in the US alone. This is a global product launch. And Samsung finally starts its exchange program in South Korea, not anywhere else. Then in October, AT&T and T-Mobile, they decide they're going to stop issuing the new Samsung Notes because there have been reports of those exploding too. But this is not Samsung yet talking about it. Samsung says it's adjusting the Note 7, it's inspecting them for quality control, and it's sure that it can fix it. And then, of course, they finally advise people to halt sales. They're going to halt production because of these fires. And the FAA issues an emergency ban on all of these. That's pretty shitty. Like, that's pretty bad when the FAA decides your phone can't fly. Like your phone's on the no-fly list. It's pretty bad. So Samsung, of course, should be like scared out of its mind. This is their website. Can you find the safety recall announcement? See that itty bitty ticker up top? That's where it is. Do you think that's why people are Googling Samsung right now? I think they're ignoring this major issue. And I think here's where you see when companies put their heads in the sand, people are upset. Now, I guarantee you, if this happened with my iPhone, which I love, I would still get the iPhone 8 because I feel like they do the right thing. I'm assuming. Maybe I'm wrong. But Samsung did put out a note in their US newsroom to let people know that you should visit your carrier or retail store to participate in the refund or exchange program. They realize it's an inconvenience. Do you think they're going to recover from this? Are people going to take the next Samsung phone when they go to refund or exchange it? I won't shame you people if you have one now, but I think it's going to be a tough sell. Okay. So how do you reassure people that phase 3? You need to develop a full response plan. Clearly, Samsung hasn't done it yet. We need to put that plan into action with an immediate remedy. And we need to communicate the results and demonstrate the results of that plan. We need to know how you're going to fix it, when you're going to fix it, and what are the results of your strategy. And then we're working on a long-term recovery plan. If I go back for a moment to Chipotle, I know my kids have no qualms about the dangers of E. coli and have gone back to asking for Chipotle every weekend. But one of the ways that Chipotle drew customers back in is they offered free meals, they offered discounts, they had free burrito days. They did everything that they could to rectify the situation and rebuild trust with their loyal customers. I think there's a company that acknowledged what happened. They shut down tens of stores, and they're trying to rebuild in earnest their reputation and the quality controls within their organization. So you have to be able to do that. You have to be able to show that you're making that effort. So quick 10 key takeaways from today. Implement those policies, because if you can prevent the crisis from even happening, you should. Use social media as a tool for monitoring. Understand the response times. You cannot sit on it. You cannot wait. If you work for a company, do you have your CEO's cell phone? Because if that crisis hit on Friday night at 9 p.m., when are you going to be able to reach him or her? And if there's a takeover of your Twitter feed or your Facebook, do you have the keys? Do you have the codes to get in there and change it? Have that framework for response. It's going to make things so much easier. Going back to Con Edison, one of the things that I do have tremendous respect for them, they are able to turn out a press release before I tell you. How long does it take the average person here to write a press release, get it approved, and get it out on the wire? 3 weeks? Well, an hour it might take you to write it, but to get it through legal or to get it through whoever, 3 weeks? 2 weeks? 1 day? A day? 15 minutes at Con Edison. They have a protocol that allows them to put out certain announcements within 15 to 30 minutes without it having to go all the way up the chain, because then nothing would ever get out. And when you have to respond quickly, you need to have that kind of flexibility. Knowing where to respond, we talked a little bit about prepping employees. What's the tone? We have seen it, you know, if you think about the Deepwater Horizon, the BP crisis, if any of you saw the CEO talking about how tired he was on his yacht, just wanted to go home, tired of the crisis. We really felt for him. So you have to know what is the tone and be transparent and be honest, because the lies always come out. Sometimes it takes years, but they do. Last thing I'll leave you with is we do have a resource on our website, on a white paper on crisis communications in the social media age. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.